It's Monday, the 6th of September 2021. Welcome to Fear and Greed, the business podcast that sets you up for a successful day. I'm Sean Aylmer. Australia's set to reopen by Christmas as the vaccination rollout hits critical milestones. That's our main story. Also coming up in today's podcast, the United Nations top climate expert tells Australia to dump coal over the next decade, the Federal Treasurer to call for a shift away from China, and a bumper grain crop on the way, assuming someone is available to harvest it. Then stay listening for my chat to the Chief Investment Officer of the country's second largest superannuation fund. But first, here's a brief look at markets. Wall Street ended little changed over the weekend after the release of jobs figures. The Labor Department employment report showed a weaker than expected 235,000 jobs were created last month in the world's biggest economy, even though the unemployment rate fell from 5.4% to 5.2%. Fed officials have indicated that they want to start tapering monthly bond purchases, but that will depend on employment, and the data was interpreted as potentially slowing the Fed down. The S&P 500 finished the weekend slightly lower, while the tech-heavy Nasdaq 100 finished up 0.2% to a new closing high. The Dow Jones Industrial Average finished down 0.2%. European markets were lower over the weekend, with the Stoxx 600 off 0.6%. London's FTSE finished down 0.4%. The S&P ASX 200 had a good close on Friday, up 0.5% to 7,552 points. It's the second week running in which the bourse finished higher, in part thanks to a better-than-expected economic growth figure for the June quarter and higher commodity prices. Mining and metals group South 32 was one of the best performers last week, up 13%, while BHP was among the worst of the large caps, down more than 5%, albeit went ex-dividend. Oil prices were lower over the weekend. Concerns about the pace of the US economic recovery on the back of the jobs figures pushed prices down, and Brent crude is currently trading around $72 a barrel. Gold was higher over the weekend and is trading close to $1,830 an ounce, and the Aussie dollar's slow climb continued, and it's currently worth about 74.5 US cents. Christmas is the new target date for the reopening of the national economy, including state borders, as New South Wales and Victoria ramp up their vaccination programs. Prime Minister Scott Morrison yesterday said state borders would be open by the end of the year, and everyone should make plans for a family Christmas. The comments are based on Mr Morrison's confidence of reaching an 80% vaccination rate by then. The national vaccination rate is currently 38%, with 62% of eligible people having received one jab, and in recent weeks, the pace of jabs has picked up substantially. There were 1,485 new cases announced yesterday in New South Wales. That's following 1,533 on Saturday, with an increasing number in regional areas. New South Wales now has 40% of its eligible population fully vaccinated, and 73% have had a first dose. Premier Gladys Berejiklian reiterated that once 70% of the population is fully vaccinated, which she expects to happen mid-next month, restrictions will lift. That means people going out for meals and attending events. Unvaccinated people will still have to live under restrictions. Ms Berejiklian's reopening plan was backed by the state Labor leader Chris Minns, who said reopening is needed to help overcome the huge toll being taken by lockdowns. Ms Berejiklian also said the state may home quarantine returning travellers who have been fully vaccinated using a reputable product. There are 183 new cases announced yesterday in Victoria and 190 on Saturday, with the vast majority of people under the age of 50. Almost 3/4 of Victoria's active coronavirus cases are now in people aged 40 years or under. Of the 89 people in hospital in the state, only one was fully vaccinated. Victoria has now passed the 60% mark for first jabs, and Premier Daniel Andrews said the state will get freedoms back when it reaches 80% full vaccination. There may be some lifting of restrictions in regional Victoria next week. The ACT recorded 15 new cases yesterday and 32 on Saturday, and Queensland recorded 1 new case yesterday. The person had been in home quarantine, though the state's chief health officer said she expected to see more cases. Throwing a spanner into the works yesterday was a British expert group that recommended against vaccinating healthy adolescents. It came a week after Australia approved vaccination of children as young as 12. But figures out of the US show that while paediatric hospitalisations for COVID-19 have jumped 5-fold, vaccinations made a huge difference. Yesterday, Federal Health Minister Greg Hunt said the decision to vaccinate 12 to 15-year-olds came on the back of health advice. COVID numbers are high, but the pace of vaccinations is a positive. And while the anti-vaccination lobby is alive and well, it's not getting anywhere near the attention it was a couple of months ago. Australians are vaccinating and we're on the way to living with COVID. In a moment, the rest of the news you need to know this morning. In overseas news, the Russian central bank has warned that a new financial crisis on the scale of the 2008 collapse could happen in less than 18 months if inflation is not kept in check. A rise in US interest rates could trigger a crisis because public and private debt has jumped sharply. Wealthy countries will have about 1.2 billion extra doses of COVID vaccines available by the end of the year. The estimate by London-based analytics firm Airfinity and reported in Bloomberg will put pressure on the US, Britain and European nations to redistribute jabs. Notwithstanding plenty of talk, very few vaccines have so far been delivered to poor nations. The longer that takes, the more likely new variants will emerge and the longer the pandemic will continue. A protest march demanding equal rights for women in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, was broken up by Taliban special forces over the weekend, who shot bullets into the air. As the country finds its way under its own rule, the Taliban has promised a more inclusive government and moderate form of Islamic rule. Let's hope so. And the Prime Minister of Japan, Yoshihide Suga, said he won't be seeking the job again, and so the country is looking for a new PM. Despite the success of the Olympics, Mr. Suga's popularity has tumbled on the back of a big rise in the number of COVID cases in the country. Locally, Australia has less than a decade to transition out of coal under a plan that would eliminate the industry in advanced economies by 2030, and the rest of the world 10 years later, according to the United Nations top climate advisor. If the world does not rapidly phase out of coal, climate change will wreak havoc right across the Australian economy, from agriculture to tourism and across the services sector. Selwyn Hart will tell a conference today, according to a report in the Financial Review. The construction, housing and property sectors will be hit hard, given so many Australians live on or near the coastline. Mr. Hart's comments challenge Prime Minister Scott Morrison's much less ambitious emissions reduction strategy. Mr. Hart will say decarbonisation is inevitable and it's the greatest commercial opportunity of our age. Meanwhile, the Prudential Regulator wants Australian banks to carefully manage risks from climate change and is pushing for improvements in risk management around environmental issues. The Australian Prudential Regulation Authority has published an information paper on the climate vulnerability assessment that is underway with the country's biggest 5 banks, which includes Macquarie. Banks are mostly at risk because they tend to lend to industries that can be hit by climate change, from agriculture and miners to property. It all comes as a KPMG CEO survey says the vast majority of local bosses believe a sense of corporate purpose is shaping capital spending and financial performance amid pressure from stakeholders on environmental, social and corporate governance concerns. It's also critical in attracting millennial workers. The Federal Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, believes a more aggressive Beijing means Australia must embrace a new national strategy to make the economy and businesses more resilient to economic coercion. The China Plus approach, which according to the Australian newspaper, Mr. Frydenberg will unveil in a speech today, aims to encourage businesses to diversify their markets, secure their supply chains, and reduce an over-reliance on China. He'll say the return of strategic competition is the defining feature of the economic and security landscape. It was the first weekend of spring selling season, and while clearance rates were strong in Sydney at least, there just weren't that many houses going up for auction. In Melbourne, the clearance rate was 44.5%, the third week in a row below 50%. In the ACT, the rate was 57%. In both those regions, there are a large number of auction listings pulled ahead of the auction due to lockdowns. West Australian grain growers anticipate one of the biggest crops on record, if they can harvest it. The crop of wheat, barley and canola is worth up to $8 billion, according to Cooperative CBH. But because of hard border closures, finding workers is proving tricky and could hinder harvesting 20 million tonnes of grain. Growers need about 1,000 workers, mostly from overseas, with experience handling big, high-tech machinery, according to a report in the Financial Review. Online retail spending reached a record $3.7 billion in July, the highest level ever, and up 19% from June, according to the Bureau of Statistics. About 27% of online sales are food. That's not growing as fast as non-food items. Mind you, when about the only place you can go during lockdowns is the local supermarket, I'm not surprised online food sales aren't rising as fast. And of course, if you want to buy clothes at the moment and live in Victoria, the ACT or New South Wales, then you pretty much have to buy online. New vehicle sales jumped 33% last month compared to 12 months earlier, even though the lockdown in New South Wales hurt sales, according to the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industries. Toyota took 4 of the top 5 selling models, the Hilux, Corolla, RAV4 and Prado. The Ford Ranger also made the top 5 at number 2. More than 81,000 vehicles were sold during the month. And the incoming Chief Executive of Crown Resorts, Steve McCann, who previously ran Lend-Lease, spent last week talking up prospects for the gaming giant to investors in the media. He's upbeat about the future, saying the casino can help revitalise the Melbourne and Sydney economies once lockdowns end. Investors remain supportive, Mr McCann says, notwithstanding Crown's share price is down almost 30% since May. The Melbourne Royal Commission findings are due by the middle of next month, and the Western Australian findings are due in March next year. Up next is a daily interview, and my guest today is a Chief Investment Officer of the second largest super fund in the country. Aware Super has more than $150 billion in funds under management and is not afraid to use its weight to encourage companies to take climate action. I talked to Damien Graham about whether those companies are listening, as well as everything from the outlook for the market in coming months to whether cryptocurrency should be part of an investment strategy. Some great tips on investing from the man running one of the country's biggest funds. That's up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Then stay listening for our weekly podcast on what's happening in the world of economics. Stephen Koukoulas is our resident economist, and between last week's GDP data and tomorrow's RBA meeting, there's plenty to talk about. Fear and Greed, the week ahead, out every Monday. And there's more. If you didn't hear yesterday's Sunday edition of the podcast, then it's worth checking that one out too, simply because it's not like anything else we do. I'm joined by the rest of the Fear and Greed team for a light-hearted chat about the business news that's grabbed our attention, like how Andrew Forrest should invest his $4 billion in dividend payments and how to have an office romance when you're working from home. It's a bit of fun. I hope you like it. It's Monday, the 6th of September 2021. I'm Sean Aylmer, and that was Fear and Greed. Enjoy your day.